What happens when a global icon like Snoop Dogg disguises himself as a homeless man? A shocking confrontation in Central Park that left millions speechless and exposed a deep-rooted bias we can't ignore. Central Park buzzed quietly with activity. Joggers passed by, their rhythmic steps blending with the laughter of children playing in the distance. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and a soft breeze carried the faint sound of a street performer's saxophone from across the park. Among the energy and serenity, most people didn't notice the man sitting on a weathered bench near the fountain. His hood was pulled low, shadowing his face. His coat, patched and frayed at the edges, looked like it had been through countless winters. Mismatched sneakers peeked out beneath the hem of his jeans, and a crumpled paper bag sat beside him. It was Snoop Dogg, though no one recognized him. Hidden under his disguise, he watched quietly, blending into the backdrop of the park. His usual aura of confidence was subdued, replaced with the deliberate stillness of someone accustomed to being overlooked. He didn't need anyone's attention, not yet. The stage was set, and the experiment he had planned for weeks was finally in motion. Snoop had been troubled for months by stories of bias, injustice, and systemic prejudice. He had read the reports, seen the footage, and spoken with people who had lived through it. As someone with influence, he knew his voice carried weight, but this time, words weren't enough. He wanted to witness it firsthand, to understand the reality of unconscious bias from the perspective of those who lived it every day. This experiment wasn't just a performance, it was a statement. Snoop had crafted his disguise meticulously, choosing every element to convey a narrative. The tattered jeans, the oversized coat, the scuffed sneakers, they were a uniform of invisibility, designed to erase his celebrity and force others to see him as an ordinary person. Beneath the layers, however, his sharp mind was observing, cataloging every glance, every whisper, and every assumption. The faint hum of a car engine broke through the park's peaceful rhythm. Snoop didn't look up as the police cruiser pulled into the lot. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel as they surveyed the park. "Another one," muttered Officer Martinez, tall and sharp-featured, his tone tinged with irritation. His partner, Officer Higgins, was older and heavier, his weary expression betraying years of resignation. Martinez nodded toward Snoop. "This park's turning into a homeless camp." Higgins sighed, adjusting his belt as they began walking toward the bench. "Maybe he's harmless," Higgins said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. The two officers approached Snoop, their footsteps heavy with purpose. Snoop remained still, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he hadn't noticed them. Martinez stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over Snoop like a warning. "You can't sit here all day," Martinez said sharply, his voice cutting through the park's quiet hum. Snoop lifted his head slowly, his face still partially obscured by his hood. His expression was calm, unreadable. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied evenly, his tone firm but unthreatening. Martinez scoffed, stepping closer. "This isn't your living room," he snapped. "Find somewhere else to loiter." Higgins hung back, watching the exchange silently, his arms crossed. The tension was palpable, thickening the air around them. Nearby, a woman walking her dog slowed her steps, her gaze flicking toward the scene. Snoop's fingers brushed against the paper bag beside him as he met Martinez's glare. He didn't move, didn't flinch. The confrontation was only beginning. The younger officer, Martinez, approached Snoop with brisk, deliberate steps. His sharp gaze swept over Snoop's slouched figure, taking in the tattered coat and mismatched sneakers. Without hesitation, his voice cut through the park's tranquil hum. "What are you doing here?" Martinez demanded, his tone sharp and dismissive. Snoop barely lifted his head, his calm demeanor betraying no sign of irritation. "Eating lunch," he replied evenly, gesturing to the sandwich beside him. "Is that a problem?" Martinez snorted, crossing his arms. "This isn't a homeless shelter. You can't just sit here loitering all day." Higgins, the older officer, lingered a few steps behind, his brow furrowing slightly. "Come on, Martinez," he murmured, almost too low for anyone to hear. "He's not bothering anyone." But Martinez wasn't listening. His eyes stayed locked on Snoop, scrutinizing him like a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Let me see some ID," Martinez snapped, holding out his hand. Snoop didn't react immediately. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Why?" he asked, his voice calm. Martinez's lips curled into a smirk. "Because I asked." "What's your name?" "Or should I call you what?" "Lil Baggy Jeans, DJ Lunchbox." Higgins sighed audibly, but Snoop didn't flinch. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to Martinez. The officer flipped it open, his skeptical eyes scanning the ID. Calvin Brodus, Martinez read aloud, his tone dripping with disbelief. "This Idaho's too clean for someone like you." Snoop tilted his head, his calm gaze meeting Martinez's. "You done yet?" Martinez stiffened, his grip tightening on the ID. The tension between them grew heavier, drawing subtle glances from passers-by. Higgins shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. The encounter was just beginning. Martinez flipped the ID in his hand, inspecting it with narrowed eyes. "Too clean for a vagrant," he muttered, his voice laced with suspicion. He glanced back at Snoop, who sat calmly on the bench, his expression unreadable. "Where'd you get this?" "Off the back of a truck." Snoop met his gaze, unflinching. "It's mine. Why is that hard to believe?" His tone was steady, void of fear or anger, but there was an edge to it that seemed to prick at Martinez's ego. Officer Higgins, standing a step behind his partner, shifted uncomfortably. "Martinez, maybe we should move on. He's not doing anything illegal." His voice was measured, a subtle attempt to diffuse the growing tension. Martinez ignored him, his focus locked on Snoop. "You don't belong here," he said bluntly, slipping the ID back into Snoop's hand. "People like you make others uncomfortable." Snoop's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "I'm sitting on a bench, eating a sandwich. That uncomfortable for you?" The exchange began to draw the attention of passers-by. A man walking his dog slowed down, his brow furrowing as he watched the scene. Further down the path, a teenager discreetly raised his phone, its camera capturing every word. "Is this necessary?" someone murmured nearby, the whisper cutting through the soft hum of the park. Higgins glanced at the growing cluster of onlookers and leaned toward Martinez. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Martinez straightened, his eyes sweeping over the gathering crowd. He turned back to Snoop, his face hardening. "Let them watch. I've got nothing to hide." Snoop leaned back on the bench, his calm demeanor unwavering. It was clear that the officer was trying to provoke him, but Snoop refused to take the bait. Instead, he let the silence speak for itself, the weight of it pressing down on the moment. A woman walking her golden retriever paused nearby, her sharp gaze darting between the officers and Snoop. She had been observing the scene for a while, her frown deepening with each passing moment. Finally, she couldn't stay silent any longer. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm. "Why are you bothering him? He's just sitting there." Martinez turned sharply, his face a mixture of irritation and defensiveness. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please, move along." She tightened her grip on the dog's leash and stepped closer, her posture defiant. "This is a public park, and I think it does concern me when I see someone being harassed for no reason. He's not doing anything wrong." Martinez's jaw clenched, his frustration bubbling over. "I said, mind your own business. We're just doing our job." The woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his response. "It doesn't look like it. It looks like you're harassing someone because of how he looks. That's not your job." Nearby, the small crowd grew, phones discreetly raised to record the interaction. The atmosphere buzzed with unspoken tension. Snoop remained seated, his expression calm and composed. He glanced briefly at the woman, a subtle nod of gratitude in his eyes. Meanwhile, Martinez's irritation escalated, his sharp retorts contrasting starkly with Snoop's unshaken demeanor. Martinez crossed his arms, his piercing gaze fixed on Snoop. "You're way too calm for someone in this situation," he sneered, taking a step closer. "You're hiding something. People like you always are." Snoop glanced up, his face unreadable. His tone remained steady, almost disarming. "People like me?" he asked softly, leaning back against the bench. "What exactly does that mean?" Martinez ignored the question, his irritation mounting. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "You're sitting here like you own the place, making everyone uncomfortable. So tell me what's in the bag." Snoop gestured casually to the brown paper bag at his side. "Lunch," he replied, as calm as ever. Martinez stepped forward, snatching the bag off the bench. Higgins, standing a few feet away, sighed deeply, his expression a mix of annoyance and concern. "Martinez, let it go. He's not doing anything illegal." "Stay out of this," Martinez barked, shaking the bag slightly before opening it. Inside, he found exactly what Snoop had said, a sandwich, an apple, and a small bottle of water. The simplicity of the contents seemed to irritate him even more. "This all you've got?" Martinez asked, tossing the bag back onto the bench. Snoop nodded. "Unless lunch is a crime now, I think we're done here." The subtle defiance in Snoop's voice made Martinez's jaw tighten. He pointed a finger at Snoop, his frustration bubbling over. "You're playing games. I can feel it." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "What crime have I committed?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Sitting on a bench, eating a sandwich. Martinez's hands flexed at his sides as the growing crowd whispered and recorded. The tension between them was palpable, the officer's aggression growing more pronounced against Snoop's quiet resilience. Higgins finally stepped in, placing a hand on his partner's arm. "Enough," he said firmly. "We don't have anything on him. Let's go." But Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that he was being played. As they turned to leave, his glare lingered on Snoop, the unspoken challenge hanging heavily in the air. The quiet park atmosphere had shifted. Around the bench, a small crowd began to form, drawn by the unmistakable tension between Snoop and the officers. A group of teenagers on bikes paused a few yards away, their curious murmurs carrying through the air. Several passers-by, phones raised, recorded the unfolding scene, their screens capturing every charged moment. A jogger slowed to a stop, pulling out his earbuds as he noticed the exchange. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "He's done nothing wrong. Why are you bothering him?" His tone was firm, defiant. Martinez whipped his head around, glaring at the jogger. "Mind your own business," he barked, his frustration spilling into his voice. The jogger, unfazed, folded his arms and stood his ground, his presence adding fuel to the growing discontent in the crowd. From the distance, the sound of voices and chatter grew louder. The live streams had done their job. News crews arrived, cameras perched on tripods, their lenses zooming in on the standoff. A reporter, microphone in hand, whispered updates into the camera as she described the scene. Martinez's irritation was palpable. He glanced at the growing crowd, his fingers twitching at his sides. His authority, so easily wielded moments ago, now felt fragile at the watchful eyes of strangers. Snoop sat calmly on the bench, watching it all unfold. His presence seemed to anchor the moment, his silence louder than any protest. His steady composure stood in stark contrast to the tension emanating from Martinez. As more people gathered, whispering among themselves, the balance of power in the park began to shift. The crowd wasn't just an audience anymore, they were witnesses, and their presence was impossible to ignore. Snoop's calm, unwavering demeanor gnawed at Martinez. Every measured movement, every steady glance felt like a challenge. "I don't trust him," Martinez muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he paced in front of the bench. Higgins stood a few steps back, arms crossed, his face lined with weariness. "Let it go, Martinez," he said, his voice low but firm. "He hasn't done anything. We don't have probable cause." But Martinez couldn't let it go. He couldn't shake the way Snoop sat there, quiet and composed, as if nothing could touch him. "There's something off about him," Martinez shot back, pulling out his radio. Higgins groaned softly, running a hand over his face. "You're making this worse for no reason." Ignoring his partner, Martinez pressed the button on the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a record check on an individual Calvin Brodus. ID provided." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." Snoop's gaze didn't waver, his expression neutral as Martinez waited. The tension between them felt like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pull. The response came minutes later, the static breaking through the air. "No records found under the name Calvin Brodus," dispatch reported. "ID appears clean." Martinez's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting. Higgins shook his head. "You're reaching, Martinez. Let's go." But Martinez wasn't ready to admit defeat. He stared down at Snoop, who remained unbothered, his silence cutting deeper than words. Snoop remained seated, calm and composed, despite the tension crackling in the air. Martinez stood rigid, his jaw clenched, clearly frustrated by the lack of control he felt. The crowd watched intently, some murmuring quietly, others holding their phones aloft to record every second. Finally, Snoop stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as if to let the moment sink in. When his hood fell back, there was a collective gasp. His face was unmistakable, and whispers of recognition rippled through the gathering. "Is that?" someone in the crowd murmured. Martinez blinked, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. His hand hovered near his baton, but he didn't move. "No way," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the growing buzz. Snoop didn't speak yet. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a sleek black phone. With a tap of his finger, the screen lit up, revealing a live stream in full swing. On the screen, comments scrolled rapidly, too fast to read them all. Phrases like "We're with you, Snoop," and "This is why change matters," flashed before Martinez's eyes. The number of viewers climbed into the millions, the counter ticking upward as the stream drew more attention. The world wasn't just watching, it was witnessing. "This," Snoop said finally, holding the phone up for Martinez to see, "is what accountability looks like." Martinez's face turned pale, the reality hitting him like a freight train. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The aggressive confidence he'd exuded earlier had vanished, replaced by stunned silence. Higgins stepped in, his hand gripping Martinez's shoulder. "We're done here," he said quietly, but firmly. He turned to Snoop, his expression tinged with guilt. I'm sorry." The cameras captured everything. Martinez glanced nervously at the crowd, the phones, and the news crews now zooming in on his every move. The walls were closing in. Snoop lowered the phone and took a step forward, his tall frame towering over Martinez. "Funny how the truth always finds a way out," he said, his voice calm but cutting. Martinez didn't respond. Higgins pulled him toward the cruiser, but the damage was done. As the officers retreated, Snoop turned his attention to the crowd. The tension had lifted, replaced by an electric energy. People leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. "This isn't about me," he began, his deep voice carrying across the park. "It's about something much bigger. It's about the way people are treated when no one's supposed to be watching." The crowd erupted in applause. Someone shouted, "Tell it like it is." Phones captured every word, their screens glowing in the fading sunlight. Snoop held up the phone again, showing the live stream. "Millions of people are watching this right now," he said, "and not just to see what happened to me. They're watching because they know this happens every day to people who don't have a platform, people who don't have a voice." The crowd cheered louder, their applause echoing off the nearby buildings. Even the joggers who had passed earlier stopped to listen, their expressions a mix of anger and hope. Snoop took a step closer to the gathered crowd. "This isn't about hating the police," he continued, his tone firm. "It's about holding the people in power accountable. If we don't, who will?" Nearby, a young man in a hoodie raised his phone higher, shouting, #accountability. The phrase caught on, and soon voices throughout the park echoed it. Snoop nodded, his expression serious but determined. "I'm just one man," he said. "But today we proved that one moment, one action, can spark something bigger." Martinez and Higgins, still lingering near their cruiser, exchanged a glance. Martinez's face was a mix of anger and humiliation, but Higgins looked reflective, almost ashamed. The crowd erupted again, their cheers swelling as Snoop stepped back. He raised the phone one last time, reading the hashtags that had started trending: Snoop for Justice, Park Bench Power, and Changes Starts Now. "This isn't about one park, one officer, or even one system," Snoop said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us, our choices, our actions, and how we treat each other when no one's looking. Today, we took a step forward. Let's keep walking." The applause grew louder, the sound filling every corner of the park. Cameras panned over the crowd, capturing the moment that would soon dominate headlines. Martinez stood frozen, his face drained of color, as the sleek black SUV pulled into the park. From the vehicle emerged Captain Jane Monroe, a tall, commanding woman in her mid-40s with piercing eyes and an air of unshakable authority. She moved with purpose, the badge clipped to her belt gleaming under the late afternoon sun. "Officers," she began, her voice firm, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "What's the situation here?" Higgins stepped forward, his expression tinged with regret. "Ma'am, we—" "Save it," she interrupted, her gaze locking onto Martinez, who now looked as though the ground might swallow him whole. "I've seen the live stream. I've heard everything." Martinez's jaw tightened as Captain Monroe reached into her coat and produced a tablet. On the screen, the live footage of his interaction with Snoop was playing in real time, the comments section a torrent of outrage and disgust. "What were you thinking?" Monroe demanded, her voice sharp. You've not only embarrassed this department, but you've violated the trust we're sworn to uphold. Martinez opened his mouth, but no words came out. Higgins glanced at him, his discomfort palpable, but he remained silent. Officer Martinez, Monroe continued, her tone icy, hand over your badge and weapon. Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave pending an investigation. The crowd, now swelling with onlookers, erupted into cheers. Phones were raised higher as people captured every moment of the dramatic takedown. Martinez hesitated, his fingers twitching near his belt. But ma'am, I. Now Monroe snapped, her voice brooking no argument. With trembling hands, Martinez unclipped his badge and gun, handing them over with a defeated expression. The weight of his actions bore down on him as whispers of his humiliation rippled through the crowd. Higgins stepped forward, visibly shaken. Ma'am, I should have done more to de-escalate. I take responsibility. Monroe's expression softened slightly but remained stern. You'll face a reprimand, she said, but your failure to act doesn't compare to what your partner has done here today. As Martinez was led toward another cruiser, the crowd clapped and cheered, their voices carrying a mix of triumph and relief. His career lay in ruins, his humiliation now a public spectacle. Captain Monroe turned to Snoop, nodding firmly. We'll handle this from here, Mr. Dogg. Justice will be served. Snoop offered a faint smile but said nothing, his calm gaze following Martinez as he disappeared from view. The video of the encounter between Snoop Dogg and Officer Martinez exploded online within hours. Shared by millions, the live-streamed footage quickly became a rallying cry against systemic bias. Hashtags like Justice for All and Snoop Exposes Bias dominated social media platforms. The stark contrast between Martinez's aggressive demeanor and Snoop's calm defiance struck a nerve with viewers. News outlets wasted no time picking up the story. Major networks aired segments dissecting the video, with anchors calling it a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight against profiling. Panels of experts debated the broader implications, while activists pointed to the footage as undeniable proof of a system in dire need of reform. Martinez's actions came under immediate public scrutiny. His dismissive comments, the unnecessary escalation, and his inability to handle the situation professionally became focal points for widespread criticism. Public opinion turned against him swiftly, with viewers from across the nation denouncing his behavior. In New York City, the reaction was palpable. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "End profiling now and justice demands accountability." Chants of "We see you" filled the air as the demand for action grew louder. The NIPT released a statement late that night, acknowledging the incident and promising a thorough investigation. But the damage to Martinez's reputation was already done. His name became synonymous with misconduct, and his actions became a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked bias. For Snoop, the video's viral spread underscored the power of visibility. What started as a quiet experiment in Central Park had sparked a nationwide debate, putting a spotlight on issues that could no longer be ignored. Martinez's downfall was swift and unforgiving. The viral video triggered a tidal wave of public outrage, with countless voices condemning his actions as a blatant abuse of power. His superiors at the precinct, under mounting pressure from both the public and the media, issued a strongly worded statement disavowing his behavior. Officer Martinez's actions do not reflect the values of our department, the statement read. We are committed to accountability and justice. The internal investigation into Martinez's conduct moved quickly. Witness statements, body camera footage, and the viral live stream painted a damning picture. Reports highlighted not just his actions during the encounter, but a troubling history of complaints alleging aggressive behavior and implicit bias. Protests outside the precinct grew larger with each passing day. Community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens came together to demand systemic reforms. This isn't just about one bad officer, a speaker declared at a rally. It's about a system that allows this to happen. We won't stop until we see real change. Martinez's professional life unraveled before his eyes. Stripped of his badge and placed on indefinite suspension, he became a pariah within the department. His colleagues distanced themselves, reluctant to defend someone whose actions had sparked such widespread condemnation. The fallout extended beyond his career. Martinez faced intense media scrutiny, with reporters digging into his record and personal life. Protesters called for broader reforms, and discussions about mandatory bias training and oversight committees gained momentum. As the public demand for accountability grew, Martinez found himself isolated and disgraced. His once confident demeanor was replaced by an air of defeat as the weight of his actions bore down on him. The world was watching, and his downfall became a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power. As the dust settled on the viral incident, Snoop Dogg sat quietly in his studio, reflecting on the storm he had set in motion. The video, viewed by millions, had done more than expose one officer's actions. It had ignited a nationwide conversation about systemic bias. Snoop understood the power of visibility. "This isn't just about one officer," he said during an interview. "It's about the system. A system that needs to be held accountable if we're ever going to see real change." He replayed the moments in his mind, the tension on the bench, the rising crowd, and the officer's growing frustration. Each detail reminded him why he had embarked on this experiment. It wasn't about revenge or spectacle. It was about bringing hidden injustices into the light. Snoop knew the work wasn't over. The exposure was only the first step. With his team, he began mapping out new initiatives to address the deeply ingrained biases in law enforcement and beyond. His vision included funding community programs, launching campaigns to promote awareness, and advocating for policies that mandated bias training for officers nationwide. He also planned to partner with activists and organizations that had been fighting this fight long before his involvement. "Change takes collective effort," he said. "It's not just about me, it's about all of us pushing for a better future." The viral incident gave Snoop a platform that few could ignore, and he intended to use it wisely. With each message of support pouring in from across the globe, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. As he looked out at the city's skyline that evening, he thought about the countless voices still unheard, and vowed to keep fighting until they too were seen and respected. As the days passed after the dramatic events in Central Park, the impact of Snoop Dogg's social experiment continued to grow. The live-streamed confrontation had not only gone viral but had sparked intense debates across social media, news outlets, and dinner tables around the country. Snoop, however, knew that conversations alone were not enough. Action was needed to turn this moment into lasting change. Standing at a podium during a press conference in Los Angeles, Snoop made his next move clear. Cameras flashed, reporters jotted down notes, and supporters gathered to hear what he had to say. Dressed sharply, but with his signature laid-back charisma, Snoop began speaking with a conviction that left the room hanging on his every word. "This isn't just about one bad encounter," he said, his voice steady and firm. "It's about a system that's been broken for too long, and it's time to fix it." He went on to announce the launch of the Benchmark Foundation, a new initiative focused on addressing systemic biases in policing and fostering trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The foundation, he explained, would fund programs for police reform, community education, and support for victims of injustice. One of the key aspects of the foundation would be hosting workshops to train officers on de-escalation techniques and the importance of cultural sensitivity. "Accountability begins with understanding," Snoop said. "We need officers who see people, not just problems." Snoop also pledged to collaborate with community activists, legal experts, and policymakers. His goal was to create legislation that would enforce stricter penalties for officers who abuse their power while providing incentives for departments that demonstrate measurable progress in equity and fairness. "Change takes time, but it also takes effort," he continued. "I'm not here to shame or blame. I'm here to make things better for everyone." The announcement was met with overwhelming support. Social media lit up with hashtags like Snoop for Justice and Benchmark Change. Activists from across the nation reached out, offering to partner with the foundation. Even lawmakers expressed interest in working with Snoop to draft policies aimed at reducing systemic bias. In addition to tackling police reform, the foundation would also focus on empowering marginalized communities. Snoop outlined plans to fund after-school programs, scholarships, and mentorship initiatives designed to uplift youth in underserved neighborhoods. "If we want to break cycles of inequality, we have to invest in the future," he said. The press conference ended with Snoop fielding questions, his calm but passionate demeanor leaving no doubt about his commitment. "This is just the start," he said, his gaze steady as he addressed the crowd. "It's going to take all of us activists, leaders, everyday people to create a system that works for everyone. And I promise you, I'm in this for the long haul." The launch of the Benchmark Foundation signaled a new chapter in Snoop's journey. He had turned a single encounter in the park into a nationwide call for reform, showing that one moment of courage can lead to a lifetime of impact. As the evening sun cast golden light over Central Park, Snoop Dogg prepared to leave the bench where the day's events had unfolded. The air was cooler now, the hum of the park softer as families began heading home and joggers finished their laps. Yet something lingered in the atmosphere, a sense of importance, as though this ordinary bench had transformed into something extraordinary. Before standing, Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He took a pen, scribbled a few words, and placed the note carefully under the edge of the weathered bench. His message was simple but profound. Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Snoop glanced at the bench one last time, his lips curving into a faint smile. The message wasn't just for whoever might find the note. It was for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or undervalued. The bench had become a stage for change, a quiet monument to resilience and courage. As news of the incident continued to spread, the bench itself began to draw attention. Days later, park goers noticed the note and shared it online, sparking a wave of heartfelt responses. The words resonated deeply, especially with those who had faced discrimination or struggled to find their place in the world. Over time, the bench became a symbol of hope. Visitors would leave their own notes tucked under its edges, sharing stories of perseverance, gratitude, and solidarity. Some left flowers, while others came to sit quietly, reflecting on their own journeys. It wasn't just a piece of park furniture anymore. It was a reminder that small moments could spark big changes. Community leaders and activists started gathering at the bench to hold discussions about systemic bias and the importance of equity. It became a meeting point for those who wanted to make a difference, a place where strangers connected over a shared desire for justice. Children would stop and ask their parents about the stories tied to the bench, sparking conversations about kindness, respect, and standing up for what's right. For many, the simple act of visiting the bench became a way to honor those fighting for equality. Snoop himself returned to the park weeks later, quietly observing from a distance. He watched as a young woman read one of the notes left on the bench, her eyes filling with tears before she carefully added her own. A group of teenagers gathered nearby, recording a video about the legacy of the bench and its meaning to their community. The bench's transformation was a powerful reminder of what could happen when people chose to act. A single moment of courage paired with the simple truth that every story matters had created ripples that spread far beyond the park. For Snoop, the bench wasn't just a symbol of what he'd accomplished that day. It was a testament to what was possible when people refused to stay silent. As he walked away, his heart was full, knowing the legacy of the bench would continue to inspire long after the sun set on Central Park.